Picture this, a simple farmhouse in the French countryside, where a 13-year-old girl hears whispers on the wind. Not just any whispers, voices that call her name with divine urgency. Saints Michael, Catherine, and Margaret speak to her, their words burning with purpose. They tell her she will save France. Imagine the weight of that moment, how a peasant girl, barely more than a child, would rise from obscurity to lead armies, crown a king, and shake the foundations of medieval Europe. This is where the legend of Joan of Arc begins, but her story is more than just battles and glory. It's a tale of mysterious visions that guided her every step, of military brilliance defying all logic, and of a trial so controversial it would echo through history. Was she truly chosen by God, or were her voices something else entirely? How did an untrained girl outwit seasoned generals, and why, after saving her country, was she betrayed and burned at the stake? The mysteries of Joan's life run deep, and today we're peeling back the layers of history to uncover the truth behind the warrior saint. Stay with us, because by the end, you'll question everything you thought you knew about the Maid of Orléans. From the quiet fields of Domrémy to the corridors of power, Joan's path was anything but ordinary. Let's step back into her world, a world where faith and fate collided in ways no one could have predicted. Born into a family of peasants around the year 1412, Joan's early life was as unremarkable as any other child in her village. Her father, Jacques, was a farmer, and her mother, Isabelle, instilled in her a deep devotion to the Catholic faith. Domrémy was a small, tight-knit community, far removed from the chaos of the 100 Years' War tearing France apart. But even here, the distant echoes of conflict reached their ears, stories of English invasions, of a French crown in crisis, and of a Dauphin struggling to claim his birthright. Then came the voices. It began when Joan was just 13 years old, standing alone in her father's garden. A voice, clear and commanding, spoke to her from what she later described as a blinding light. It was the Archangel Michael, flanked by Saints Catherine and Margaret, messengers of God with a mission for her. They told her she had been chosen for a sacred purpose, to drive the English from France and see the Dauphin crowned as its rightful king. Imagine the weight of that revelation. A girl with no education, no military training, no connections to power was being called to reshape history. At first, Joan kept these visions to herself. She was devout, but she wasn't reckless. She understood how the world worked, how people would react to a peasant girl claiming divine guidance. And when she finally confided in her family and neighbors, the skepticism was immediate. Some dismissed her as delusional. Others whispered that she was touched by something darker. Even her own father threatened to drown her if she tried to pursue such madness. But the voices persisted, growing more urgent as the years passed. By 16, Joan could no longer ignore them. The turning point came in 1428, when the saints commanded her to leave Domrémy and seek out Robert de Baudricourt, a local garrison commander. This was no small task. Traveling alone as a young woman was dangerous, and convincing a hardened soldier to take her seriously seemed impossible. Yet Joan, armed with nothing but conviction, set out. When she arrived in Vaucouleurs, Baudricourt mocked her, a girl claiming to hear saints demanding an army. It was laughable, but Joan didn't back down. She spoke with such certainty, such fire, that even the most cynical among them couldn't dismiss her entirely. And when she predicted a military reversal near Orléans, a prediction that later proved true, Baudricourt reluctantly agreed to escort her to Chinon, where the Dauphin waited. This was the moment everything changed. A peasant girl, once ignored even by her own village, was now on her way to the court of a future king. But the hardest part was yet to come, convincing Charles that she was the key to his salvation. Now, with the weight of her divine mission pressing upon her, Joan faced her greatest challenge yet, winning the trust of Charles VII. The journey to Chinon was no small feat. Traveling through war-torn France, Joan and her small escort navigated enemy territory, dodging Burgundian patrols and bandits along the way. Her peasant dress and cropped hair, an early sign of defiance against traditional expectations, made her stand out. But she pressed forward, driven by unshakable faith. When she arrived at Chinon Castle, the courtiers sneered, a girl in men's clothing claiming to be sent by God. The Dauphin himself was wary. France was fractured, his legitimacy questioned, his armies defeated. The last thing he needed was to be associated with a heretic. So he devised a test. The story goes that when Joan entered the crowded hall, Charles hid among his nobles, disguised as one of them. Yet without hesitation, she walked straight to him, knelt, and declared, "Gentle Dauphin, I am Joan the maid. The King of Heaven sends me to tell you that you shall be crowned at Rheims." Some say she revealed a secret known only to him, a private prayer he had made. Others claim she simply recognized his royal bearing. Whatever the truth, that moment shattered doubt. Why would a desperate prince gamble on a peasant girl? The answer lay in France's despair. Years of English domination had crushed morale. Charles needed a miracle, something to reignite hope, to unite his fractured kingdom behind him. Joan's conviction, her uncanny knowledge, and the growing rumors of her divine mission offered exactly that. But not everyone was convinced. The court's theologians interrogated her, probing for heresy or deceit. Yet Joan's answers, though simple, were unshakable. She spoke of her voices with such clarity that even the most skeptical hesitated. After weeks of scrutiny, Charles made his choice. He gave her armor, a banner, and a place at the head of his army. This was no mere act of faith, it was a calculated risk. By embracing Joan, Charles transformed her into a symbol, a living banner under which France could rally. And so, with the Dauphin's blessing, Joan set her sights on Orléans, where her legend would truly begin. Now, as Joan stepped onto the battlefield, her appearance alone became a weapon. Clad in gleaming white armor, a banner fluttering at her side, and a sword said to have been divinely guided to her, she was no longer just a peasant girl, she was a living emblem of hope. Let's unravel the power behind these symbols and how they shaped her legend. The white armor Joan wore wasn't just practical, it was a statement. In an era where armor was typically darkened to conceal wear and tear, her polished, radiant suit stood out vividly. This wasn't mere vanity. White symbolized purity and divine favor, a visual declaration that she fought under God's banner. To the French troops, it was a beacon, a sign that heaven marched with them. To the English, it stirred unease. How could a mere girl, untouched by battle, command such presence unless something supernatural was at work? Then there was her banner, emblazoned with images of Christ and angels, the words Jesus Maria woven into the fabric. Joan cherished it more than her sword, claiming it carried the very blessing of her voices. On the battlefield, it served as a rallying point, a constant reminder of the sacred cause. Soldiers who faltered at the sight of enemy forces found courage when they saw that banner rising above the chaos. It wasn't just cloth, it was a promise. And what of her sword? The story of its discovery reads like something from legend. Joan directed knights to a small church in St. Catherine de Fierbois, insisting a blade lay buried behind the altar. Exactly where she said, they found an ancient sword, its rust miraculously shaken off with ease. Whether by divine guidance or shrewd calculation, the effect was the same. Wielding a weapon tied to St. Catherine, a martyr Joan claimed spoke to her, amplified her mystique. Every time she raised it, allies saw a warrior chosen by heaven. Enemies saw a heresy that needed crushing, but perhaps the most potent symbol was Joan herself, a girl in men's clothing leading armies. In defying expectations of gender and station, she became something beyond human in the eyes of friend and foe alike. Her armor, banner, and sword weren't just tools. They were fragments of a story she wove with every step, one that convinced a broken nation to believe in miracles. And as she rode toward Orléans, that story was about to face its greatest test. Now, with her symbols casting an almost mystical aura, Joan faced her first true test, the Siege of Orléans. This wasn't just a battle, it was the moment France held its breath, waiting to see if this teenage girl could deliver the miracle she promised. The city of Orléans had been under English siege for months, its people starving, its walls buckling. The French army, demoralized and fragmented, seemed powerless to break the stranglehold. But Joan arrived with more than weapons. She brought something far more potent, unshakable belief. Her first move defied all convention. Instead of waiting for reinforcements or plotting cautious maneuvers, Joan rode straight through the English lines, her banner held high. The enemy, stunned by her audacity, hesitated just long enough for her to slip into the city. Imagine the scene, a girl in white armor, cutting through the chaos like a blade through fog, lifting the spirits of soldiers who had forgotten what hope felt like. She didn't just join the fight, she reignited it. Then came her tactics. Medieval warfare was a game of patience, of sieges lasting years. Joan shattered that playbook. She attacked English strongholds one by one, not with slow, methodical assaults, but with relentless, almost reckless speed. At the fort of Saint-Loup, she led the charge herself, her presence turning retreating men back into the fray. When a commander urged caution, she snapped, "We must act now or we lose our chance." Her instincts proved right. The fort fell within hours, but the most striking moment came at Les Tourelles, the strongest English position. After a brutal day of fighting, Joan was wounded by an arrow to the shoulder. As she was carried from the field, French morale crumbled. Then, just as defeat seemed certain, she did the unthinkable. She ripped the arrow out herself, climbed back onto her horse, and returned to the front lines. That was all it took. The French surged forward, and the English, who had watched this girl rise again like something out of legend, broke ranks and fled. And then there was the wind. Witnesses swore that as Joan's forces pressed their final attack, the wind shifted violently, blowing smoke and dust into the faces of the English archers, crippling their aim. Coincidence perhaps, but to those who saw it, it was proof. The siege was broken, Orléans was free. In just 9 days, Joan had done what seasoned commanders couldn't in half a year. Her victory wasn't just military, it was psychological. The English, who had mocked her as a witch or a deluded peasant, now whispered of sorcery. The French, who had doubted her, now called her La Pucelle, the maid, the savior. And the tide of the war, once hopelessly against them, began to turn. But for Joan, this was only the beginning. Ahead lay greater battles, greater triumphs, and a destiny that would burn brighter and shorter than anyone could imagine. With Orléans liberated, Joan's legend only grew, but she had no time to rest. The momentum was surging, and she was determined to press the advantage. What followed was a series of lightning-fast victories that left even her allies in awe. At Jargeau, the English held a heavily fortified position, confident their defenses could withstand any assault. Joan saw it differently. Instead of a prolonged siege, she ordered an immediate attack, leading from the front as French troops stormed the walls under a hail of arrows. When hesitation crept in, she climbed a scaling ladder herself, shouting for her men to follow. The town fell within a day. Then came Meung, where the English had fortified the bridge over the Loire. Rather than a direct assault, Joan divided her forces, sending a contingent to feint at the bridge while the rest crossed upstream, flanking the enemy. The English, caught off guard, abandoned their position in chaos. But the crowning moment came at Patay, a battle that would become a masterpiece of Joan's unconventional tactics. The English, led by the famed commander John Fastolf, had assembled a formidable force, their longbowmen positioned to devastate any frontal charge. The French commanders, remembering past disasters like Agincourt, urged caution. Joan overruled them. She scouted the terrain herself, identifying a narrow path through the woods that would allow her cavalry to bypass the deadly archers. When the moment came, her knights erupted from the trees, crashing into the English before they could form their defensive lines. Fastolf fled, and the rout was total. What made these victories extraordinary wasn't just their speed, it was how they defied every expectation. seasoned French generals had spent years losing to the English, trapped in outdated strategies. Joan, with no formal training, outthought them all. Where they saw risk, she saw opportunity. Where they preached patience, she acted. Her secret, a blend of boldness and intuition, as if her divine voices weren't just guiding her faith but her battlefield instincts. The English, who had mocked her as a fanatic, now faced a commander who seemed to rewrite the rules of war with every move. Yet even as her star burned brightest, shadows gathered. The French court, once eager to ride her coattails, began to whisper, could a peasant girl truly be the architect of their salvation? And if she was, what did that say about them? The next chapter would test not just Joan's skill in battle, but her place in a world that revered miracles yet feared those who performed them. Now the tide had turned, and France was ready to crown its rightful king. With the English in retreat and the road to Rheims cleared, Joan stood on the brink of fulfilling her divine mission, to see Charles VII anointed as the undisputed ruler of France. The coronation wasn't just ceremony. It was the ultimate act of defiance against England's claim to the throne, a sacred ritual that would cement Charles's legitimacy in the eyes of both God and his people. Joan's presence at Rheims Cathedral on that July day in 1429 was no accident. She had fought for this moment, quite literally clearing the path to the city with her victories. As the Dauphin knelt before the altar, she stood nearby, her banner in hand. The same banner she'd carried into battle, now bearing witness to the culmination of her prophecy. The oil of Clovis, France's ancient holy chrism, touched Charles's brow, transforming him from a disputed heir to God's chosen king. And Joan, she was more than a soldier now. She was a living symbol, the hand of the divine that had lifted France from despair. Crowds wept as she knelt before the newly crowned king, her armor gleaming in the candlelight. But even in this moment of triumph, the cracks began to show. The coronation should have been Joan's ultimate victory, yet it revealed the limits of her influence. Charles, now secure in his title, grew hesitant. His advisors, nobles who had once dismissed Joan, now saw her popularity as a threat. Why listen to a peasant girl when the war seemed all but won? Political games replaced battlefield urgency. While Joan pushed to march on Paris and drive the English out completely, the king's court favored diplomacy and delay. The shift was subtle but devastating. Joan's voices still commanded her to fight, but the court no longer heeded her counsel. Supplies for her troops dwindled. Promised reinforcements never arrived. The very men who had cheered her at Rheims now whispered that her miracles had served their purpose. Worse, they questioned whether her divine guidance had ever been real, or simply a convenient tool to rally the masses. This was the cruel irony of Joan's success. By making Charles king, she had undermined her own necessity. The coronation marked the peak of her influence, but it also set the stage for her fall. Without the Dauphin's desperate need for legitimacy, Joan became expendable. The next phase of her story wouldn't be fought on open battlefields, but in shadowed corridors of power where her enemies waited with quiet calculation. The girl who had united France would soon find herself standing alone. Yet even as Joan's influence waned at court, the battlefield still called to her. Forces were gathering in Compiègne, a town under siege by the Burgundians, England's powerful allies. Despite the king's reluctance, Joan rode out once more in May 1430, leading a small band of loyal soldiers. What followed would become one of history's most debated moments. Compiègne should have been a straightforward defense, but as Joan's forces clashed with the Burgundians outside the city gates, something went terribly wrong. Historical accounts suggest her troops were outmaneuvered, cut off from retreat when the town's drawbridge was raised prematurely. Was this a tragic miscommunication or something darker? Some scholars point to the sudden withdrawal of flanking forces that day, hinting at possible betrayal by commanders resentful of her fame. Others argue it was simply the chaos of war, a momentary lapse that left Joan stranded. What's undeniable is the Burgundians' frenzy to capture her. Their English allies had long branded Joan a witch and heretic, a dangerous symbol uniting the French. For the Burgundians, handing her over meant political favor and gold. They dragged her to their stronghold at Beaurevoir, where she was held for months. Yet even imprisonment couldn't break her spirit. Stories claim she leaped from a tower to escape, surviving the fall despite injuries. A desperate act that only deepened her enemies' determination to silence her. The alliance between England and Burgundy was no accident of war. Both sides needed Joan discredited. To the English, she was a peasant who'd humiliated their armies. To the Burgundian nobility, she threatened the established order. Together, they orchestrated her transfer to Rouen, an English-controlled city where a trial wasn't just planned, it was rehearsed. Every detail, from the handpicked judges to the charges, was designed to tear down her divine mission. And here lies the cruelest twist. Joan's capture didn't stem from battlefield failure, but from her unwavering boldness. She'd refused to heed the king's caution, trusting her voices over political calculations. In the end, that very resolve, the trait that saved France, made her a target none of her allies would risk defending. The girl who once rallied armies now stood alone, imprisoned not just by enemies but by the very kingdom she'd crowned. Now the stage was set for one of the most infamous trials in history. In Rouen, under English control, Joan found herself at the mercy of men who had already decided her fate. The proceedings were less about justice and more about crushing her influence once and for all. Leading the charge was Bishop Pierre Cauchon, a man whose loyalty to the English crown outweighed any pretense of impartiality. His goal wasn't to uncover the truth, it was to dismantle Joan's credibility piece by piece. Cauchon handpicked a court stacked with theologians and clergymen hostile to Joan's claims. Many of them were financially or politically tied to England or the Burgundians, making their bias impossible to ignore. Even the location of the trial was suspect. Rouen was deep in English-held territory, far from any neutral or French sympathetic voices that might have defended her. The trial wasn't just rigged, it was a carefully staged performance designed to humiliate and condemn. The charges against Joan were a mix of religious and political accusations, carefully crafted to paint her as a heretic and a threat. They targeted everything from her voices to her choice of clothing, twisting her actions into crimes. Most damningly, they accused her of rejecting the authority of the church, though in reality, Joan always insisted her voices came from God. The court, however, refused to accept any divine explanation, insisting she was either lying or deceived by the devil. What made the trial even more irregular were the blatant violations of standard legal procedures. Joan was denied proper counsel, a basic right even by medieval standards. She faced relentless interrogation, sometimes multiple times a day, with questions designed to trap her in contradictions. At one point, she was even threatened with torture, though historical records suggest it may not have been carried out. The psychological pressure was immense, meant to break her down before the public verdict was delivered. But perhaps the most telling detail of all was the trial's political nature. The English weren't just punishing a prisoner of war, they were erasing a symbol. Joan's victories had shattered the myth of English invincibility, and her continued existence, even in chains, posed a danger. If they could prove her a heretic, they could undermine everything she'd achieved and discredit Charles VII's coronation as divinely sanctioned. As the trial dragged on, Joan's resilience became her greatest weapon. Despite her isolation and the overwhelming odds, she answered with a mix of wit and stubborn faith. When pressed about whether she was in God's grace, a theological trap, she famously replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God keep me there." Even her enemies noted her composure, a defiance that only deepened their determination to break her. Behind the scenes, however, the outcome was never in doubt. Every piece of evidence, every interrogation was leading toward a single, inevitable conclusion. The trial of Joan of Arc wasn't about truth, it was about power. And as the final act approached, the question wasn't whether she would be condemned, but how her story would end. As the trial tightened its grip, the sheer volume of charges against Joan of Arc revealed just how determined her enemies were to destroy her reputation. The court leveled a staggering 70 accusations, each crafted to chip away at her credibility. They ranged from heresy and witchcraft to the seemingly mundane, like wearing men's clothing, but every charge carried deadly weight. The goal was clear: to paint Joan as a dangerous outlier, someone who defied both divine and earthly authority. Heresy stood at the heart of the accusations. The court insisted Joan's voices, those of Saints Michael, Catherine, and Margaret, were either fabrications or demonic deceptions. They demanded she renounce them, but Joan held firm. "I would rather die than deny what my voices have told me," she shot back, a defiance that only fueled the judge's outrage. Her unwavering faith became her armor, but in their eyes it was proof of her guilt. Then came the charge of cross-dressing, a seemingly odd focus for a trial about heresy. But in medieval Europe, clothing was deeply tied to identity and social order. By wearing men's armor, Joan had blurred the lines of gender, a transgression her accusers twisted into evidence of moral corruption. She countered with practicality. The attire protected her from assault and allowed her to lead troops effectively. Yet the court refused to listen. To them, her choice was a flagrant rejection of God's natural order. Perhaps the most politically charged accusation was her refusal to submit to what the court called the church militant, the earthly authority of bishops and popes. Joan insisted her voices came directly from God, bypassing the church's hierarchy. This was explosive. If divine guidance could come without clerical approval, it undermined the very institution prosecuting her. The judges framed it as rebellion, but Joan saw it as loyalty to a higher truth. Her responses during interrogations were a masterclass in cunning resilience. When trapped with convoluted theological questions, she often answered with simplicity or wit. Asked if she knew she was in God's grace, a trick question, since claiming certainty could be deemed heresy, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. And if I am, may God keep me there." The courtroom fell silent. Even her enemies recognized the brilliance of her evasion, but the trial's outcome was never about fairness. Every charge, every exchange was a step toward a predetermined verdict. The 70 accusations were less about crimes and more about dismantling a legend. Joan's real offense wasn't heresy or cross-dressing. It was proving that a peasant girl could defy empires and win, and for that, the powers of her time would ensure she never left that courtroom alive. With the trial's verdict all but certain, Joan's suffering intensified behind the cold stone walls of her prison cell. Stripped of her armor and dignity, she endured conditions designed to crush both body and spirit. Chained day and night in a dim, damp cell, she faced constant surveillance by hostile English guards who tormented her with threats of assault. The psychological warfare was as calculated as the legal proceedings, every moment meant to erode her resolve. Sleep deprivation became a relentless weapon. Guards would bang on her cell door at random intervals, jolting her awake whenever exhaustion threatened to bring her respite. The goal was to disorient her, to leave her vulnerable to manipulation when dragged back into the courtroom. Contemporary accounts describe her growing pallor, the hollows beneath her eyes deepening as weeks dragged on without proper rest. Yet even in this shattered state, she clung to her voices, whispering prayers to saints only she could hear. The threat of sexual violence loomed large. Male guards openly mocked her devotion to chastity, promising to break her virginity as they had broken her military victories. One chronicler claims they even dressed a nobleman in priest's robes, sending him to hear her confession while making lewd suggestions. For Joan, whose faith equated purity with divine favor, this psychological torture cut deeper than physical pain. Her captors understood that destroying her spiritual certainty would be their ultimate victory. By May, the unthinkable happened. Deprived of sleep, isolated from allies, and terrified by her jailer's threats, Joan finally cracked. In a moment of desperate weakness, she signed a confession she likely couldn't even read. The document written in Latin, a language she didn't understand. It was a hollow victory for her persecutors. The shaky mark on that parchment wasn't a true surrender, but the act of a starving, sleep-deprived teenager pushed beyond human limits. Witnesses reported her sobbing as they led her back to the cell, the weight of her supposed betrayal crushing what little strength remained. Yet even here, Joan's story takes an unexpected turn. Within days, she would make a choice that shocked her captors, one that would seal her fate but cement her legend. The broken prisoner they thought they'd created was about to show them the unbreakable spirit that had rallied armies and crowned kings. But here's where the story takes a dark and pivotal turn. Joan's recantation, known as the Abjuration, was anything but straightforward. The document she signed was written in Latin, a language she couldn't read, and the terms were deliberately vague. It forced her to renounce her voices, her divine mission, even the very armor she'd worn as God's soldier. But here's the cruel twist: her jailers never intended to honor their side of the bargain. The moment she signed, they switched tactics. Though the confession spared her the immediate death sentence, her captors now demanded she fully submit to the church by wearing women's clothes. This wasn't about modesty, it was a trap. For Joan, men's clothing had been practical armor in battle, but also a sacred vow. Her voices had instructed her to dress as a soldier to preserve her chastity. To abandon it meant betraying them, and then the bait was set. Historians still debate whether her guards deliberately left men's garments in her cell, or if Joan, in despair, chose them herself. Either way, the outcome was the same. When she was found wearing them days later, her enemies pounced. This was their proof she'd relapsed into heresy. The abjuration, they declared, was void. Now there would be no mercy. The speed of their reaction tells you everything. Within hours, Bishop Cochon declared her a relapsed heretic, and the English governor, frantic to be rid of her, ordered execution within days. No more trials, no more debates. Joan's fate was sealed the moment those clothes touched her body. Some scholars argue this was always the plan, to push her to recant, then force her into a situation where she'd undo it. A rigged game from the start, yet even in this, Joan's defiance shines. By reclaiming her male attire, she wasn't just breaking a rule, she was reclaiming her truth. The voices she'd denied in weakness, she now affirmed in strength. Her final act wasn't a surrender, but a last, unyielding stand, and her enemies, so eager to trap her, only proved what she'd always known. They weren't judges, but executioners in robes. And so, with cruel irony, the very thing they'd used to condemn her, those rough, practical clothes, became the final symbol of her unbroken spirit. The stage was now set for the fire at Rouen, but Joan, in her final days, would meet it not as a broken prisoner, but as the warrior saint the world remembers. Now, as we step into the final, harrowing chapter of Joan's story, the air grows heavy with smoke and the weight of history. On the morning of May 30, 1431, Rouen's marketplace transformed into a stage for one of the most infamous executions in medieval Europe. A crowd gathered, some hostile, others whispering in pity, as Joan was led to the stake, her slight figure dwarfed by the towering pyre. But here's what history remembers most vividly: her composure. Even as the flames licked closer, she asked for a crucifix. An English soldier, moved by her courage, fashioned one from 2 sticks and handed it to her. She clutched it to her chest, her last act a silent defiance against those who sought to erase her faith. Then came the fire. Witnesses reported eerie details: how Joan cried out, "Jesus," repeatedly as the smoke swallowed her, how some claimed her heart refused to burn even after the flames consumed her body. This detail, whether legend or fact, became a symbol of her unbreakable spirit. The English, terrified her remains might inspire rebellion, ordered her ashes scattered in the Seine. They understood the power of relics. Joan's charred bones could have become sacred objects, rallying cries for a France still fighting to reclaim its soul. But here's the cruel irony: their efforts to erase her only magnified her legacy. The execution, meant to humiliate and silence, backfired. Those who watched that day carried stories of her courage into the world. The soldier who gave her the crucifix, the scribe who recorded her final words, even some in the crowd left questioning whether they'd just burned a heretic or a saint. And that uncertainty, that haunting doubt, is precisely what made Joan immortal. The flames at Rouen didn't end her story, they ignited it. Within decades, her name would be cleansed, her trial overturned, and her enemies disgraced. But in that moment, as the smoke curled into the sky, all that remained was a girl, a makeshift cross, and a question that would echo through centuries. Had France just lost a warrior or gained a martyr? Yet history, as it often does, refused to let Joan's story end in ashes. 2.5 decades after her execution, the very kingdom she fought to save would finally turn the tables on her accusers. With the dust of war settling and England's grip on France weakening, King Charles VII saw an opportunity, not just to honor Joan, but to solidify his own legacy. The year was 1456, and the stage was set for a dramatic reversal. Charles, now secure on the throne, ordered a retrial in Rouen, the same city where Joan had been condemned. But this time, the proceedings weren't about condemning a heretic. They were about dismantling a lie. Witnesses who'd been silenced or ignored in 1431 were finally heard. Soldiers who'd fought beside her testified to her piety. Clergymen exposed the irregularities of the original trial, pointing out how Bishop Corchon had violated church law by denying her legal counsel and stacking the jury with English allies. Even surviving jurors from the first trial confessed they'd voted under duress. Why did Charles wait 25 years? Politics, as always, played its part. Immediately after Joan's death, the king had been in no position to challenge the church or England. But by the 1450s, France had reclaimed much of its territory, and Charles needed to cement his divine legitimacy, the very thing Joan had secured for him at Reims. Rehabilitating her wasn't just an act of justice, it was a strategic move to reinforce his God-given right to rule. The testimonies were damning. One priest recounted how Joan had wept upon seeing a painting of Christ suffering, proving her deep faith. A scribe revealed that the infamous abjuration document she'd signed, the one used to condemn her, had been altered after her arrest. Most compelling were the accounts of her final moments, how she'd called on Jesus until the smoke stole her voice, how even her executioner feared he'd burned a saint. In July 1456, the verdict came like thunder. The original trial was declared null, its findings tainted by fraud, calumny, and injustice. Joan was proclaimed innocent, a martyr wronged by corrupt men. For Charles, it was a triumph; for France, a reckoning. The girl who'd been burned as a heretic was now the standard-bearer of a resurgent nation. And in that moment, something extraordinary happened. Joan of Arc ceased to be merely a historical figure. She became a symbol of resilience, of faith, of a country's unbroken spirit. Yet the question lingers: why did it take so long? Perhaps because saints, like legends, are never born in calm waters. They emerge when the tides of history are ready to carry them. Now, let's turn our attention to the very heart of Joan's story, the voices that guided her. These mysterious visions, which she claimed came from saints and angels, have puzzled historians, theologians, and scientists for centuries. Were they divine messages, symptoms of a medical condition, or something more calculated? One theory, of course, is that Joan truly experienced divine intervention. She described hearing the voices of Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, who instructed her to save France. In a time when faith permeated every aspect of life, this explanation was widely accepted by her supporters. Medieval Europe was a world where miracles were believed to happen, and saints frequently appeared in visions. Joan's unwavering conviction, her ability to rally armies and inspire a king, lends weight to the idea that she genuinely believed in these encounters. But modern science offers alternative explanations. Some researchers suggest Joan may have suffered from epilepsy, specifically a form known as temporal lobe epilepsy, which can cause vivid auditory and visual hallucinations. These episodes often include intense religious imagery, a phenomenon documented in other historical figures. Others have proposed schizophrenia, given her reported voices and the singular focus of her mission. Yet skeptics point out that Joan displayed none of the disorganized thinking or social withdrawal typical of schizophrenia. She was remarkably coherent, even under pressure. Then there's the possibility of political manipulation. Could her voices have been a convenient narrative crafted by those who saw her as a tool to unite France? The timing was certainly suspicious. Her visions emerged as the war reached a desperate point. Some historians argue that local clergy or even members of the French court might have encouraged her claims, using her as a symbol to revive national morale. Medieval mysticism adds another layer. Visionary experiences were not uncommon, especially among women, who often used divine revelations to gain influence in a male-dominated world. Joan's voices gave her an authority she'd never have had as an illiterate peasant girl. Even her judges at trial fixated on them, desperate to prove she was either a fraud or a heretic. So what's the truth? The answer, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. Joan's voices could have been a blend of genuine spiritual experience, psychological phenomena, and the pressures of her time. What's undeniable is their impact. They shaped not just her destiny, but the course of history, and that, in itself, is a mystery worth pondering. Shifting our focus to the physical remnants of Joan's legacy, let's delve into the intriguing tale of her so-called relics, objects believed to carry traces of her existence long after her death. In 2006, a startling claim emerged from an unlikely place, the attic of a Parisian pharmacy. Researchers announced they discovered charred remains, including a rib bone and fragments of cloth, allegedly tied to Joan's execution. The news ignited a frenzy, offering what seemed like a tangible connection to the martyred saint. But as scientists examined the relics, the truth proved far stranger. The bones weren't Joan's at all. They belonged to an Egyptian mummy, and the cloth dated to a much later period. The discovery was a dead end, yet the fascination with her relics endured. Why does this myth persist? In medieval Europe, relics weren't just keepsakes, they were sacred objects imbued with divine power. Fragments of saints' bodies or possessions were believed to heal the sick, protect cities, and even win battles. Joan's status as a martyr and her dramatic death made her relics particularly coveted. The English, desperate to erase her influence, scattered her ashes in the Seine to prevent them from becoming objects of veneration. But legends sprang up almost immediately, claiming loyal followers had secretly preserved fragments of her remains. These stories gave hope to a France still reeling from her loss, transforming her relics into symbols of resistance and faith. The 2006 hoax wasn't the first time false relics surfaced. Over the centuries, everything from charred wood supposedly from her pyre to locks of her hair have appeared, each debunked, yet each renewing the longing for a physical piece of her story. This cycle reveals something deeper. Joan's relics aren't just about bones or artifacts. They represent the human desire to touch history, to bridge the gap between the past and present. For believers, they're a testament to her sanctity. For skeptics, a reminder of how easily myth intertwines with fact. Even today, the search continues. Modern technology could, in theory, authenticate genuine relics if they ever surfaced. But perhaps the power of these objects lies not in their authenticity, but in what they symbolize: Joan's unbreakable spirit and the enduring mystery of her life. Whether real or imagined, her relics keep her story alive, inviting us to ponder the thin line between faith and legend. Now, let's turn to one of the most striking aspects of Joan's story: her decision to wear men's armor and clothing. a choice that became a lightning rod during her trial and continues to spark debate centuries later. To modern eyes, it might seem like a practical move for a warrior, but in 15th century France, it was nothing short of revolutionary. Joan's adoption of male attire wasn't just about functionality, though that certainly played a part. Armor was designed for men, and wearing it properly required the accompanying clothing: loose trousers, tunics, and short haircuts to avoid entanglement in battle. But there was more to it. Joan claimed her voices instructed her to dress this way, framing it as a divine command. For her, it was both a spiritual duty and a necessity for her mission. Yet to her accusers, it was heresy, a blatant violation of biblical injunctions against cross-dressing, which they weaponized to paint her as a sinner. Medieval society was rigidly patriarchal, with strict boundaries between male and female roles. Women were expected to be wives, mothers, or nuns, not warriors leading armies. Joan's defiance upended these norms, and her enemies seized on it. During her trial, prosecutors fixated on her clothing, grilling her relentlessly about why she refused to wear dresses even in prison. Their obsession reveals their fear. Joan wasn't just breaking gender rules, she was proving they could be shattered. Her very existence challenged the idea that women were inherently weaker or less capable, something the all-male tribunal couldn't tolerate. But Joan's cross-dressing also became a tactical misstep. After months of imprisonment, she briefly agreed to wear women's clothes, only to switch back a moment her jailers exploited. Some historians argue she was tricked into resuming male attire, while others believe she did so to protect herself from assault in a male-dominated prison. Either way, it gave her accusers the excuse they needed to declare her a relapsed heretic, sealing her fate. The irony: Joan's clothing, meant to protect her, became the pretext for her execution. Yet her choice resonates far beyond her trial. Today, scholars debate whether she was an early feminist icon, a devout mystic, or simply a pragmatist. What's undeniable is that her defiance, wearing armor in a world that demanded she stay in a dress, forced history to confront the absurdity of rigid gender roles. Whether inspired by God, strategy, or sheer will, Joan's cross-dressing wasn't just about fabric, it was a rebellion etched in steel. This defiance still captivates us because it speaks to a timeless truth. Sometimes, to change the world, you first have to dare to dress for the part. And in doing so, Joan didn't just wear men's clothes, she rewrote the rules. Shifting our gaze from the battlefield to the canvas and the page, let's explore how Joan of Arc's legacy has been molded and reimagined through art and literature across centuries. Her story, already larger than life, has inspired countless interpretations, each reflecting the values and biases of its time. From cynical portrayals to reverent tributes, Joan's image has been as fluid as it is enduring. One of the earliest and most controversial literary depictions comes from William Shakespeare, who painted Joan as a cunning, almost villainous figure in Henry VI, Part 1. Here, she's a witch-like manipulator, a far cry from the saintly maiden of French lore. Shakespeare's Joan speaks to the English distrust of her legend, reducing her divine mission to sorcery and deceit. It's a stark reminder of how history is often written by the victors, or in this case, the rivals. Fast forward to the 19th century, and Mark Twain's personal recollections of Joan of Arc offers a dramatic contrast. Twain, an American skeptic, surprised readers with his deeply sympathetic biography, portraying Joan as a pure, almost otherworldly hero. He spent 12 years researching her life, and his Joan is a beacon of integrity, a deliberate rebuttal to the cynicism of earlier accounts. Twain's work reflects a growing romantic idealization of Joan, one that emphasized her innocence and martyrdom. Visual art, too, has played a pivotal role in shaping her myth. Paintings like Jules Bastian-Lepag's Joan of Arc capture her in moments of divine revelation, bathed in ethereal light, while Paul Gauguin's lesser-known depiction strips away the glamour, presenting her as a vulnerable, flesh and blood woman. These artworks don't just illustrate her story, they reinterpret it, asking us to see her as visionary, warrior, or even victim. But perhaps no medium has immortalized Joan as powerfully as film. Carl Theodor Dreyer's 1928 silent masterpiece, The Passion of Joan of Arc, is a visceral, unflinching look at her trial, focusing on her suffering and spiritual resolve. Shot almost entirely in close-ups, the film's raw intensity makes her anguish palpable, turning her into a universal symbol of persecution. Decades later, directors like Luc Besson and Bruno Dumont would offer their own takes, from the hyper-stylized The Messenger to the surreal Ginette, the childhood of Joan of Arc, proving her story remains endlessly adaptable. Even opera has embraced Joan's drama. Giuseppe Verdi's Giovanna d'Arco and Arthur Honegger's Jeanne d'Arc au Boucher blend music and myth, elevating her to near mythic status. These works don't just recount history, they amplify its emotional core, letting audiences feel her triumphs and despair in ways textbooks never could. What's fascinating is how each era's Joan reflects its own anxieties and aspirations. The Enlightenment saw her as a rational leader, the Victorians as a pious maiden, and modern feminists as a gender-defying rebel. Her chameleon-like presence in art underscores a timeless truth. Joan isn't just a historical figure, she's a mirror constantly reshaped to show us who we are or who we wish to be. And as long as artists keep reimagining her, her legend will never burn out. Now let's turn our attention to one of the most persistent enigmas surrounding Joan of Arc, the tantalizing rumors that she somehow cheated death. After all, how could a figure so larger than life simply vanish in smoke? Over the centuries, whispers have swirled that the woman burned at the stake in Rouen wasn't Joan at all, but a substitute, while the real heroine slipped away to live in secret. One of the most famous survival myths centers around a woman known as Claude des Armoises, who appeared years after Joan's execution claiming to be the lost warrior. She bore a striking resemblance to Joan, knew intimate details of her life, and even managed to convince some of Joan's own brothers. For a time, she traveled through towns, accepted gifts, and dined with nobles who seemed all too eager to believe the maid had returned. But cracks soon appeared in her story. She lacked Joan's distinctive battle scars, and her knowledge of military campaigns was suspiciously vague. Eventually exposed as an imposter, the truth behind Claude remains murky. Was she a cunning fraud, a deluded woman, or perhaps even a pawn in a political game? Then there's the theory that Joan's execution was staged entirely. Some point to the fact that her face was obscured by a hood during the burning, fueling speculation that another prisoner, a heretic or a volunteer, took her place. Others argue that powerful allies, perhaps even members of the French court, arranged her escape to avoid making her a martyr. But why would the English go to such lengths only to fake her death? Their obsession with erasing her influence suggests they'd want undeniable proof of her end. And yet, the absence of her ashes reportedly scattered to prevent relic worship only deepens the mystery. What's fascinating is why these myths endure. Joan's story is one of such improbable triumph against the odds that her survival feels almost poetic. We want to believe someone so extraordinary couldn't be undone by something as ordinary as political betrayal. It's the same impulse that fuels modern conspiracy theories, the refusal to accept that legends can meet mundane ends. In Joan's case, her martyrdom is central to her mythos, yet the idea of her escaping offers a different kind of solace, the hope that courage, once ignited, can't be so easily extinguished. Even today, fringe historians and storytellers revive these theories, blending fact and folklore. From novels to documentaries, the what if of Joan's survival keeps her story alive in ways history alone can't. Whether as a secret wife, a hidden saint, or a woman who simply walked away, these alternate endings speak less about Joan's time and more about ours, revealing our longing for second acts and unfinished stories. But let's shift our focus from the whispers of survival to something far more concrete: the moment Joan of Arc was officially recognized as a saint by the Catholic Church, nearly 500 years after her death. This wasn't just a religious milestone, it was the culmination of centuries of shifting perceptions, political calculations, and a carefully orchestrated campaign to transform a condemned heretic into a celestial patron. The road to Joan's canonization in 1920 was long and deliberate. The Church didn't rush the process, and for good reason. To declare someone a saint requires proof of miracles, events that defy natural explanation and are directly tied to the candidate's intercession. In Joan's case, two key miracles sealed her sainthood. The first involved a French nun named Sister Thérèse of St. Augustine, who claimed to have been cured of chronic stomach ulcers after praying to Joan in 1876. The second, more dramatic case was the healing of a young woman named Maria Bouillet in 1909, who recovered from advanced tuberculosis after her family invoked Joan's name. Skeptics might question these claims, but for the Church, they were evidence of divine favor, proof that Joan wasn't just a historical figure but a heavenly advocate. Why did it take so long for the Church to embrace her? After all, Joan's rehabilitation trial in 1456 had already overturned her heresy conviction. The answer lies in the delicate dance between faith and politics. In the centuries following her death, Joan became a potent symbol for various factions: monarchists, republicans, even revolutionaries, all claiming her legacy. The Church, wary of aligning too closely with nationalist movements, kept its distance until the timing was strategic. By the late 19th century, France was deeply divided between secular republicans and conservative Catholics. Canonizing Joan was a way for the Church to reclaim her as a unifying figure, one who could bridge the gap between faith and patriotism, and that's exactly what happened. When Pope Benedict XV finally declared Joan a saint, it wasn't just a spiritual act, it was a political masterstroke. France, still reeling from the devastation of World War I, clung to her as a symbol of resilience and divine favor. Churches dedicated to her sprang up across the country, and her feast day, May the 30th, became a national celebration. Joan's dual identity as both saint and patriot was now inseparable. To the faithful, she was a messenger of God. To the French people, she was the embodiment of their nation's soul, a peasant girl who defied empires and, in death, became immortal. Even today, her canonization resonates. The Catholic Church honors her as the patron saint of France, soldiers, and even radio broadcasters, a nod to the heavenly voices that guided her. But beyond the titles, Joan's sainthood reflects something deeper: humanity's need to elevate ordinary individuals into extraordinary symbols. Whether as a religious icon or a national hero, Joan of Arc's journey from the stake to the altar proves that sometimes history's most controversial figures are the ones who endure longest, not despite their contradictions, but because of them. Now, let's turn to a fascinating twist in Joan of Arc's legacy: how a medieval peasant girl became an unexpected icon for women's empowerment. Centuries after her death, Joan's story took on new life, not just as a religious or national symbol, but as a beacon for feminists fighting to redefine a woman's place in the world. In her own time, Joan's actions were nothing short of radical. Imagine a teenage girl dressed in men's armor, leading armies and dictating strategy to seasoned generals, all while claiming direct communication with the divine. In the 15th century, this wasn't just unusual, it was unthinkable. Medieval society had strict ideas about gender roles. Women were expected to be wives, mothers, or nuns, not warriors or political figures. Yet Joan defied every expectation. She didn't ask for permission, she acted. And though her enemies used her cross-dressing and defiance as proof of heresy, modern feminists see something else entirely: a woman who refused to be confined by the limits of her era. Fast forward to the 19th century, when Joan's story found fresh resonance with the suffragette movement. Women fighting for the right to vote and equality under the law saw in Joan a kindred spirit. Here was a woman who had challenged male-dominated power structures and won, at least for a time. Figures like Emmeline Pankhurst, leader of the British suffragettes, invoked Joan's name as a rallying cry. Pankhurst even referred to her followers as Joans of Arc, drawing a direct line between Joan's resistance and their own struggle for political rights. In the United States, suffragists staged pageants and plays about Joan, casting her as a martyr for justice, a narrative that mirrored their own battles. But Joan's feminist legacy isn't just confined to history books. In the 20th and 21st centuries, she's been reinterpreted through ever-evolving feminist lenses. Some scholars highlight her as an early example of a woman asserting agency in a world designed to silence her. Others critique the ways her story has been romanticized, pointing out that Joan's success relied on framing herself as an exception, a divinely chosen maiden, not a model for all women. And then there's the irony: the same church that burned her for heresy later canonized her, raising questions about who gets to claim her legacy and why. Modern movements continue to draw inspiration from her. Activists cite her courage in the face of overwhelming oppression, her refusal to back down even when the stakes were life and death. At the same time, feminists grapple with the complexities of her story, how her sanctification sometimes softens the radical edges of her defiance, turning a rebel into a saint. Yet that tension is precisely what makes her enduring. Joan wasn't just a woman out of time, she was a mirror for every generation, reflecting their own struggles and aspirations. So what does Joan's feminism mean today? It's a reminder that the fight for equality isn't new, and that history's most unlikely figures can become its most powerful symbols. Whether as a warrior, a martyr, or a saint, Joan of Arc proves that courage doesn't wear a gender, and perhaps that's her most lasting rebellion of all. Now, let's step onto the battlefield and examine Joan of Arc's military legacy, a topic that still sparks debate among historians. Was she a tactical genius, or did fortune simply favor her? The answer lies in the audacious strategies she employed, which defied the conventions of medieval warfare. At first glance, Joan's approach seemed reckless. She favored frontal assaults, a tactic most commanders avoided due to its high risk. Medieval battles often revolved around sieges, feints, and attrition, but Joan charged headfirst into the fray. Take the Siege of Orléans, her first major victory. While French generals hesitated, she led a direct attack on the English fortifications, rallying demoralized troops with sheer force of will. Her boldness paid off. The siege was broken in just 9 days, a feat that stunned Europe. But was it luck or skill? Modern military analysts note that her aggression exploited key weaknesses. The English, stretched thin and overconfident, weren't prepared for her relentless momentum. Joan didn't just fight battles, she shattered expectations. Then there's her mastery of morale. In an era where soldiers fought for pay or obligation, Joan inspired something rare: belief. She didn't just command, she convinced her troops that divine favor was on their side. Before Patay, one of her most decisive victories, she promised her army they would win without losing a single man, a claim that seemed absurd until it came true. Her ability to turn frightened peasants into fervent warriors wasn't just charisma, it was psychological warfare. The English, accustomed to outnumbering their foes, suddenly faced an enemy who fought with terrifying conviction. Critics argue her successes were flukes, that she benefited from France's desperate need for a miracle and the English army's internal strife. Yet even her failures reveal cunning. At Paris, her ill-fated assault was repelled, but the attack revealed her adaptability. She regrouped, shifted tactics, and continued campaigning, proving she wasn't just a one-dimensional leader. So where does this leave her legacy? Some see a visionary who grasped the power of morale and momentum long before modern military theory formalized them. Others insist she was an amateur. Her victories owed more to circumstance than strategy, but perhaps the truth lies in between. Joan didn't play by the rulebook because she'd never read one. Instead, she rewrote the rules and in doing so changed the course of history. Her tactics may not fit neatly into textbooks, but their impact is undeniable. Whether by divine guidance, instinct, or sheer force of personality, Joan of Arc fought like no one else, and that, in the end, was her greatest weapon. With this in mind, let's shift our focus to how Joan's enemies saw her, because their perspective adds yet another layer to her enigmatic story. Now, let's step into the shoes of Joan of Arc's adversaries, the English and their Burgundian allies, to uncover how they viewed this seemingly unstoppable force. To them, Joan wasn't a saint or a savior. She was a heretic, a witch, and a political nightmare. Their chronicles paint a starkly different portrait, one dripping with fear and disdain. Take Shakespeare's portrayal in Henry VI, Part 1. Written over a century after her death, the bard reduces Joan to a cunning, almost demonic figure. He dismisses her visions as tricks, her victories as flukes, and even implies she consorted with dark forces. This wasn't just artistic license, it reflected England's enduring bitterness. After all, Joan had humiliated them on the battlefield and unraveled their grip on France. Burgundian accounts were even harsher. Their chroniclers, allied with the English, labeled her a false prophet and mocked her peasant origins. One Burgundian knight wrote that her voices were the devil's whispers, a convenient narrative to undermine her divine mission. These weren't neutral observations, they were propaganda designed to justify her capture and execution. Yet time has a way of shifting perspectives. By the 19th century, even British historians began grudgingly admitting Joan's brilliance. Winston Churchill, in his History of the English-speaking peoples, called her the genius of the situation, acknowledging her unmatched ability to rally a broken nation. How did the English go from vilifying her to praising her? Part of it was distance. Centuries softened the sting of defeat, but it was also recognition of her sheer audacity. Modern military strategists, including British ones, now study her campaigns for lessons in morale and unconventional warfare. The contrast between medieval slander and modern admiration reveals something deeper. Joan terrified her enemies not just because she won battles, but because she defied every expectation. To the English, a peasant girl leading armies was unnatural. Her success threatened the very order of their world. That fear lingers in their early accounts, dripping from every accusation. Yet even they couldn't erase her impact. Today, you'll find plaques in England honoring her courage, a far cry from the flames of Rouen. This shifting gaze, from hatred to respect, adds yet another layer to Joan's enigma. She was a mirror reflecting back the biases and fears of those who wrote about her. And perhaps that's the greatest testament to her legacy. Even her enemies couldn't ignore her. With this duality in mind, let's turn to how Joan's story has been reimagined in art and literature, where myth and history collide in unforgettable ways. Now shift your gaze to the modern era, where Joan of Arc's legend has found new life in the pixels of video games, the frames of films, and the pages of graphic novels. Her story, once confined to medieval chronicles, now thrives in the digital age, reshaped by creators who see in her an endless well of inspiration. Take Age of Empires, for instance. Here, Joan isn't just a historical figure, she's a playable hero leading armies to victory in campaigns that echo her real-life triumphs. The game simplifies her complexity, yes, but it also introduces her to generations who might never crack open a history book. Meanwhile, in Fate/Apocrypha, an anime series, she's reimagined as a divine warrior, her saintly aura amplified by fantastical elements. These adaptations aren't accurate, but they're not meant to be. They're gateways sparking curiosity about the real woman behind the myth. Then there's The Maid, a recent TV series that dives deeper, portraying Joan's struggles with doubt and faith. Unlike the idealized versions of the past, this Joan feels human, vulnerable, yet relentless. The show's creators didn't shy away from the darker facets of her story, like the psychological torment of her trial. It's a reminder that her appeal lies not just in her victories, but in her raw, unfiltered humanity. But why does Joan still captivate? For filmmakers and game designers, she's the ultimate underdog, a teenager who defied kings and changed history. Her blend of mysticism and military genius offers a template for storytelling that's both epic and intimate. And let's not forget the visual drama, the armor, the banners, the flames. These elements translate effortlessly to screens, large and small. Even in literature, Joan's adaptability shines. Graphic novels like Joan of Arc, a story of faith, distill her life into vivid panels, while Margaret George's novel The Confessions of Young Joan reimagines her inner world with lyrical depth. Each version, whether highbrow or pop culture, latches onto a different facet of her enigma: the warrior, the martyr, the rebel. What ties these modern takes together is their refusal to let Joan be pinned down. She's a canvas endlessly reinterpreted to reflect contemporary obsessions: feminism, faith, the clash of individuality against systems of power. And that's the magic of her legacy. 500 years later, she's still speaking, still daring us to ask, who was she really? The answer, it seems, depends on who's telling the story. As we near the end of our journey, let's step back and weigh the most enduring question of all: saint, heretic, or something far more elusive? The clues lie in the contradictions she left behind. So where does that leave us with Joan of Arc? Centuries later, her story still crackles with unanswered questions. Those voices that guided her, were they divine whispers, the echoes of a remarkable mind, or something else entirely? Her rise from a peasant girl to a military leader defies logic, yet history confirms it happened. And her fall, betrayed, condemned, burned at just 19, remains one of history's most haunting tragedies. Her legacy is a paradox. To France, she's the maiden who saved a nation, a symbol of resilience. To the Church, she's a saint canonized 500 years after her death. To skeptics, she's a puzzle, a teenage girl who outmaneuvered kings and generals, then paid the ultimate price. But here's the thing: Joan refuses to fit neatly into any category. She wasn't just a warrior or a mystic or a victim. She was all of them, a collision of contradictions that still fascinates us. Maybe that's why her story keeps evolving, why filmmakers, writers, and even game designers can't leave her alone. She's a mirror, reflecting whatever we need her to be: a feminist icon, a religious zealot, a military prodigy. So let's end with this. What do you see when you look at Joan of Arc? A saint touched by God, a heretic who dared too much, or something stranger? A girl who heard voices and changed the world, leaving us to unravel the mystery. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've been hooked by her story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. History's full of enigmas, but few are as unforgettable as Joan.